Not every story begins with grand events. Some begin subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the gleam of a chain in the sun. On the sweltering afternoon in Greenville, Millie walked through the bustling city, each step resonating like a note in a melody that only she seemed to hear. The golden chain around her neck swayed discreetly, momentarily capturing the incandescent light and the distracted gaze of some passers-by. To them, it was just a piece of gold. To Millie, it was an entire world. The weight of that jewelry didn't come from its precious metal, but from the memories it carried. It was a gift from Noah, her husband, a link to everything he represented, love, promises, and a secret that time had not been able to erase. Millie never left the house without it, as if that small object were a shield against the surprises of destiny, and on that day she would need that invisible amulet more than ever. In the chaos of Greenville, where hurried steps crossed paths with horns and disordered voices, something was about to happen, something that would begin as subtly as the gleam of a chain, but would end up completely altering the course of her life. As the sky burned in shades of fire, Millie walked, unaware that she was about to be dragged into the heart of a story that would test not only her strength, but the depth of her decisions. Help our channel grow. Leave a like, subscribe, and activate the bell to stay updated on upcoming content. And we want to know, where are you watching us from? Comment below. On the sidewalk near a row of police cars, a man in uniform observed the movement with a cold gaze. He held a coffee cup, but his attention seemed to wander. Joe, a police officer with years of experience, didn't carry in his eyes the wisdom time should have granted him. His rigid posture and the slight smile of superiority drew something deeper, an excessive confidence in the power his badge represented. Does the uniform of a law enforcement officer only reflect the duty to protect? Or can it for some become a tool for control, a symbol of something darker? For Joe, the meaning had been lost. Authority was not a responsibility, but a right he believed he had, often crossing the line from ethical to personal. The world, to him, was made of categories, invisible barriers that divided people into those who belong and those who don't. As his eyes wandered, something caught his attention. It was Millie, walking with her characteristic grace. The gleam of the golden chain around her neck reflected the sunlight, and for a moment it dazzled Joe. But it wasn't just the object that unsettled him. There was something about her he couldn't ignore. Her upright posture, confident gaze, and lack of submission, all of that irritated him deeply, even though he himself couldn't understand why. The gleam of Millie's chain seemed more intense to Joe's eyes than any other detail around him. It wasn't just the gold that bothered him, but the way she walked, head held high, eyes steady, and confident steps. She showed no fear, didn't avert her gaze as many would when crossing paths with an officer in uniform. To him, it seemed like an affront, a direct challenge to the authority he believed he held. Without much thought, Joe placed the coffee cup on the hood of the patrol car and raised his voice. "Hey, you there?" His tone was harsh, more of an order than a call. Millie stopped, her expression showing surprise and a touch of caution. She slowly turned, her gaze calm but attentive. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice polite yet firm, as if she had faced similar situations before. Joe approached, scrutinizing her with squinted eyes. He pointed at the chain with a gesture, his tone filled with distrust. "That chain," he began, completely ignoring the courtesy of the situation. "Where did you get it?" Millie raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question, but she answered calmly. "It's mine," she said, her voice firm but without hostility. "It was a gift from my husband." Joe crossed his arms, tilting his head in a gesture that mixed disbelief and disdain. "A gift, huh? Seems like something that costs more than you're used to carrying. Are you sure it's yours?" He didn't ask. he implied. Coincidentally, you look a lot like the description of someone involved in a recent robbery. Millie's face hardened, her eyes now focused directly on his. I can assure you, officer, she said, her voice still controlled but with a tone that didn't ask for permission to be heard. That chain is mine. I haven't stolen anything. For a moment, the air around them seemed heavier. It was more than just a simple question or an unjust accusation. It was a silent battle where words carried weight and respect was at stake. Click subscribe and activate notifications. Only then will you stay updated on our upcoming videos and not miss anything. Joe didn't want to listen. To him, Millie's words were just noise, an attempt to escape what he had already decided was the truth. He looked her up and down, as if each detail reinforced his prejudiced conviction. The gleam of the chain, her confident posture, even the controlled tone of her voice, all seemed to irritate him even more. Ah, of course, a convenient story, he said with a tone full of sarcasm. You always have an excuse, right? Millie felt the impact of his words, but she didn't let them break her. Her clenched jaw betrayed her growing indignation, but her response was firm. People like me, she asked, each word filled with disbelief. What exactly are you trying to imply? Joe stepped forward, closing the distance between them even further. His posture was threatening, and the intention was clear. You know exactly what I mean, he replied with a cold stare. Now let's finish this. I need you to come with me to the station. We'll clear everything up there. Millie's frustration grew, but she wasn't intimidated. I haven't done anything wrong, she asserted firmly, though her heart raced not with fear but with indignation. You're making a mistake. Joe let out a dry laugh, almost as if he were enjoying it. The only mistake here, he mocked, is that you think you can walk around with something that clearly isn't yours. Now enough talk. Millie took a deep breath, trying to control what little patience she had left. Officer, she began, once again attempting to appeal to logic, I'm asking you to think about what you're doing. This chain is mine, and I haven't committed any crime. Don't make a decision you'll regret later. But Joe didn't listen. In fact, her words only served to inflate his ego further. Regret? He laughed, a bitter laugh that echoed in the street. You know what's funny? Teaching people like you to know your place. That's what's really worth it. Millie's calm almost broke in the face of such provocation, but she stood tall, staring at him resolutely. I'll say this once, she said, her voice low but full of determination. You don't know who I am or what you're about to do. Joe laughed again, a sound brimming with contempt. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, he replied, taking the handcuffs from his belt. And now, enough talk. Let's finish this here and now. Joe took the handcuffs with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes, as if this moment were a personal victory. However, as he made the gesture to cuff her, Millie acted with calculated calm. Her hand slid discreetly into the pocket of her dress, where her phone was hidden. With a quick and precise touch, she pressed a button. The call was made. Without saying a word or changing her expression, she knew the other side would understand. Noah always understood. Joe didn't notice anything. To him, the metallic sound of the handcuffs closing around Millie's wrists was a symbol of his imposed authority. Let's see how long all that attitude lasts behind bars, he mocked, with an ironic smile full of arrogance. Millie didn't respond. Her serene expression remained intact, even as he led her toward the patrol car. She entered the back seat with steady steps, sitting with a dignity that seemed to dismantle the very meaning of the handcuffs on her wrists. But inside, her mind was active, every thought organizing the next move. She knew this moment was bigger than a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was something much larger. How many others like her had faced similar situations with no resources, no one to listen to their voices? How many times had the people who were supposed to protect been the ones oppressing? It wasn't just her fight, it was the fight of many. As the patrol car started moving, Millie remained silent. There was no need for words. She knew that Noah, on the other side of that call, was listening to everything. Every word from Joe, every gesture of contempt fueled the determination of the man she knew wouldn't let this go. He would be there, and when he arrived, it wouldn't be just for her, but for all those who had been silenced. Want more content like this? Then give us a like, subscribe and activate the bell, because there's always new content here, and you won't want to miss out. Joe walked into the station with Millie ahead, his chest puffed out as if he had just captured a dangerous fugitive. His exaggerated posture caught attention, but not in the way he expected. Colleagues looked up from their desks, exchanging curious and confused glances. Something was wrong with that scene, and Joe's arrogance only heightened the tension in the air, but he didn't notice, completely absorbed in his power play. When they reached the counter to register the incident, Joe leaned on the desk casually, as if he wanted to display a non-existent triumph. "You should be grateful," he began, his voice filled with contempt. "I'm not adding any more charges, although I could. Your attitude, completely inappropriate for someone like you. I think it's time you learned your place." Millie looked at him, her eyes fixed, not blinking. The calm she displayed seemed to disarm every attempt at intimidation. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice firm, with no trace of doubt. "But don't worry, it will be clear soon." Joe let out a laugh, an empty sound that echoed in the room. "We'll see about that," he replied, convinced he had control of the situation. What Joe didn't know was that, while he was trying to reaffirm himself, the winds had already shifted. Millie's discreet call had triggered a chain of events he couldn't foresee. Noah, her husband and police captain, was already on his way. Every word heard through the call fueled a deep indignation that went beyond the personal. For Noah, this wasn't just an affront against his wife, but a reflection of a failure he would not allow in his team. "This channel grows thanks to you. Subscribing may seem small, but it's a great gesture for our work." As Noah drove with determination, his jaw was clenched, his expression somber. He wasn't planning a dramatic entrance, but his mere presence would carry all the weight needed. Joe still believed he controlled the situation, but what was about to happen would completely change the dynamics of the room. Noah walked into the station without haste, but his mere presence had an impact that words could not reach. Every firm step echoed in the atmosphere, and the gleam of his badge seemed even brighter under the fluorescent light. Murmurs ceased, and the eyes of the officers converged on him. Some straightened their posture instinctively, while others exchanged alert glances. Noah didn't need to announce his authority. It was ingrained in his posture and the respect his name carried. His eyes scanned the room like a silent scanner, until they landed on Joe, who was still talking loudly, laughing between words, and gesturing as if he had an audience. He was enthusiastically describing his great capture, seemingly oblivious to the growing weight of silence around him. "Joe," Noah said, his voice firm and precise, like the slam of a door. The sound resonated, and Joe froze immediately, looking up. His expression shifted from confident to nervous in seconds. "Captain!" He tried to smile, a wavering smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't know you were coming today." Noah didn't give in to the false cordiality. His voice remained cold, like a blade cutting through the air. "I wouldn't be here," he said, weighing each word. "But I received information on my way home that required my immediate attention." Joe swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. There was something about Noah's posture that made him feel smaller, more vulnerable. "What would that be, sir?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the tension was clear. The silence that followed was heavy. Noah kept his gaze fixed, as if analyzing every aspect of the situation before responding. He knew the next words would mark the beginning of a lesson Joe would not easily forget. Noah didn't rush to respond. His silence was more eloquent than any word he could say at that moment. He walked past Joe without even looking at him, moving with steady steps toward the cells. Each movement seemed calculated, full of a seriousness that made the entire atmosphere hold its breath. Upon reaching the cell where Millie was, his hardened expression softened slightly, but the tension in his jaw revealed the internal turmoil. "Millie," he called, his voice now softer, filled with warmth and concern. "Are you okay?" She slowly stood up, maintaining the calm and unwavering posture that defined her. "I'm fine, Noah," she replied, her voice firm but not losing its softness. "But I think you have something to discuss with one of your subordinates." Noah took a deep breath, nodding. When he turned around, his expression changed drastically. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a hard and penetrating gaze. He walked back, now facing Joe, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "Joe," Noah began, his voice full of authority, cutting through the silence like a sharp blow. "Why is my wife in a cell?" The impact of his words was immediate. The atmosphere became deadly silent, as if time had stopped. Joe's face lost all color, and his rigid posture collapsed. He blinked several times, trying to process what he had just heard. His wife?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Noah replied, his tone sharp like a knife. "My wife. The woman you decided to imprison without any valid justification." Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words seemed to make sense. He tried to gather some kind of explanation, but the weight of the situation crushed him. I thought that... she seemed suspicious. And the chain... "No," Noah interrupted, his voice low but filled with a dangerous tone that silenced any attempt at defense. "Don't make excuses. I heard everything. Do you realize how shameful your behavior was?" Joe took an involuntary step back, his legs trembling. His confident posture had completely disappeared, replaced by an unsettling vulnerability. "Captain, "No," Noah repeated, raising his hand to stop him. "Keep your apologies. There's nothing you can say that justifies what you did. You've just shown me exactly who you are. And let me make this clear. Someone like you doesn't deserve the privilege of wearing this badge." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the implications of what had just been said. Joe lowered his head, his hands trembling, unable to face the fierce gaze of the captain. Meanwhile, the other officers watched from a distance, surprised but lacking the courage to intervene. Noah's authority didn't only reside in his words, but in his unwavering presence, making it clear that this moment would not be easily forgotten. The silence in the station seemed to crush the air, making every breath heavy. The other officers, though uncomfortable, remained still, exchanging furtive glances, but none dared to speak. Noah's authority was like an impenetrable wall at that moment, and every word he spoke carried weight. "You're suspended," Noah announced, his voice firm and unwavering. From now on, you're no longer part of this team. Turn in your badge and weapon before you leave this building. And before you even think about returning, you'll have to complete anti-racism training and undergo mandatory therapy. 6 months at least." Joe seemed to collapse under the weight of the announcement. He fell to his knees, tears running down his face, words coming out like pleas. "Captain, please, I made a mistake, but I can change. Please don't do this." Noah's eyes narrowed as he watched the man in front of him. His voice remained low, but the tone was as sharp as a blade. "Do you think this is about me?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "This is about you, about how you treated people, including my wife, about how you disrespected the uniform you should represent. Joe tried to stammer another plea, but his voice was almost inaudible. "Give me another chance. Please." Before Noah could respond, Millie intervened, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "Noah," she said, stepping forward, her expression serene but firm. "Let him go through the training and therapy. Maybe he'll learn. Maybe he'll change. But don't take away the chance to show he's capable of doing so." Noah turned toward Millie, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her. There was a conflict in his eyes, as if his reason challenged him to hold back his own indignation. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly, almost as if seeking confirmation that it was truly the right thing. Millie nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "If we don't give him a chance, how will he learn?" Noah let out a deep sigh, relaxing his shoulders slightly. He turned back to Joe, now with an expression of controlled disapproval. "Fine." His voice remained firm. "You have 6 months. Prove you can change. If you fail, you're out for good. Understood?" Joe nodded quickly, still on his knees, tears on his face. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am. I promise I'll change." Noah unlocked the cell, helping Millie out. He escorted her out of the station, keeping a protective arm around her shoulders, a gesture that spoke more than any words could express. The tension was still palpable in Noah as he drove, but little by little, the silence between them became more comfortable. "You handled it well," Noah said, finally breaking the silence. He cast a quick glance at Millie, admiration evident. "Better than I would have?" Millie smiled, her expression showing a calmness that only experience and inner strength could offer. "People like him don't need hate," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They need education, and maybe, just maybe, he'll become a better person because of it." Noah extended his hand, holding hers, squeezing it with affection. "You're amazing, you know." Millie laughed softly, her laughter echoing gently through the car. "I had a good teacher." When they arrived home, the weight of the day seemed to begin to dissipate. Millie took a deep breath as she got out of the car, feeling the relief of finally being away from the tension that had accompanied her since the start of that afternoon. Noah opened the door for her, always attentive, and they both walked in together. They left the chaos of the day behind, focused on moving forward, as they always did, with strength and dignity. Then Hector, a young Latino, spoke about the day he saw his father taken away by immigration agents. He described the pain of losing a pillar of his family, even after his father had worked honestly in the country for more than 2 decades. His voice trembled, but his words were full of strength. Joe listened, initially skeptical, trying to internally justify what he was hearing. He wondered if these stories really applied to his view of the world. But as the testimonies continued, something inside him began to change. The voices around him were not abstractions, they were real experiences of suffering, struggle, and resilience. Each story slowly pierced the barriers he had built, leaving space for an understanding he had never allowed before. That day, Joe didn't say much. But as he left the room, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. And though it was uncomfortable, he knew it was the first step in a journey he needed to take. When his turn came to speak, Joe felt the weight of all the gazes upon him. His throat felt dry, and for a moment he considered remaining silent. But there was something in the stories he had heard, something that resonated in his mind like a constant reminder that he could no longer avoid reality. He took a deep breath, but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. I don't know where to begin," he admitted, looking down. "I always thought I was just doing my job, that everything I did was right because I had a badge, a uniform. But listening to you all—" He paused, feeling the lump in his throat tighten even more. "I'm starting to wonder if I've been blind this whole time." A heavy silence followed, until Sandra, the determined-looking woman who had shared her story of discrimination, raised her voice. Her expression was serious, but there was no anger in her words, only an undeniable truth. "It's not about being blind," she said, each word heavy with meaning. "It's about choosing not to see." Her words hit Joe like a punch. He blinked, confused, feeling something inside him break. It was true. He realized that his actions, his attitudes, weren't just the result of ignorance, but decisions he had made over time. Decisions to ignore the humanity of the people crossing his path. Decisions to prioritize the power his uniform gave him instead of the duty he should have fulfilled. The realization was bitter, like a mirror reflecting something he never wanted to see. Joe lowered his head, feeling a mixture of shame and remorse. But deep down, he knew that this was the beginning of something new. For the first time, he was willing to listen, to face the truths he had avoided for so long. The transformation wouldn't be easy, but at that moment, he took his first real step toward it. In the quiet and welcoming room of the therapist, Joe felt that each session was like peeling an onion, layer by layer, each more uncomfortable than the last. Dr. Patel, with her calm yet direct voice, didn't allow him to escape from his own answers. "Joe," she said, crossing her legs while holding a notebook, "why do you think you felt entitled to arrest Millie that day?" He avoided looking at her, shifting in his chair as if sitting on hot coals. I don't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Maybe because I thought I had the right. I thought I was doing my job." Dr. Patel tilted her head slightly, analyzing the response. "I see," she replied, with a tone that neither judged nor relieved. "And the words you said to her? Calling her arrogant, saying she should know her place. Did that also have something to do with your job?" The heat rose to Joe's face, burning like a mark of shame. He knew there was no justification. "No," he admitted, slowly shaking his head. That was me. It was my own prejudice speaking." Dr. Patel nodded again, her eyes showing a mix of understanding and challenge. "Good. Acknowledging that is an important first step. But what really matters now is understanding where that came from. Why did you feel you had the right to treat her that way?" Joe remained silent for a long moment. Memories from his childhood slowly surfaced, uncomfortable like a wound he was trying to avoid. As the weeks passed, these sessions forced him to revisit the past. He began to realize that many of his prejudices came from his father, a man who often expressed racist opinions casually, as if they were undeniable truths. Joe had grown up hearing racist jokes at the dinner table, absorbing the belief that some people didn't belong or should know their place. I grew up thinking that was normal," he said in one session. "My dad talked like that all the time. I never questioned it, I just accepted it." Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly, her voice maintaining the same firm but encouraging tone. "That makes sense. The environment we grow up in shapes how we see the world. But what matters now is that you're starting to question it. You can unlearn what you were taught." Those words resonated with Joe. He realized that changing wasn't just about guilt or regret, but about rebuilding an entire foundation. And though it was painful, he began to understand that facing those demons was the only way to become a better person. In that session, Dr. Patel suggested something that surprised Joe. It wasn't a conversation or direct analysis. It was a personal task that required a deeper confrontation with himself. "Joe," she began, with the calm tone he already knew, but with a seriousness he had yet to face. "I want you to write a letter, not to Millie or to Captain Noah. Write to the version of you who arrested Millie. Tell them everything you've learned since then. Be honest. Acknowledge the mistakes and harm you caused." Joe felt a knot in his stomach. The idea made him more uncomfortable than he wanted to admit, but that night, at home, he sat down at the table with paper and pen. For several minutes he stared at the blank page as if it were challenging him. Finally, he began to write. The words came out hesitantly, as if each one carried the weight of a piece of himself he didn't want to face. He wrote about the pain he had caused Millie, how he had robbed her dignity with words full of prejudice and gestures of authoritarianism. He described the empty pride he had felt in that moment, and how he now saw that as a failure, not just in his role as a police officer, but as a human being. When he arrived at the next session, he held the letter in his hands, the sheet crumpled from having reread it and adjusted every word. Dr. Patel asked him to read it out loud. He began slowly, with an unsure voice, but as he went on, his throat began to tighten. Words like arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice came off the paper as if they were direct blows against himself. "I didn't realize the harm I was causing," Joe said, his voice faltering as he tried to continue. Tears began to fall, and he stopped to take a deep breath before continuing. "I thought I was just applying the law, but I wasn't. I was applying my own prejudices." Dr. Patel waited in silence, allowing him to process the moment. When he finished reading, she finally spoke. "That's the point where many give up, Joe. Recognizing your own mistake and feeling the weight of it is hard. But you've made it this far, and that means you can keep changing." He nodded slowly, still wiping away his tears. For the first time, he felt the weight he carried begin to lift. And at the same time, he knew that this letter wasn't the end of the process, but a milestone of where he was and where he needed to go. The 6 months of suspension were transformative, but also the hardest of Joe's life. When the time came to return to the police department, he was filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. He put the uniform back on, but without the inflated sense of authority. He knew that day was just the beginning of a new chapter. Entering the station, he found Noah waiting for him, standing with his arms crossed and an expression Joe couldn't decipher. The room was silent, and it felt as if all eyes were on him, even though no one said a word. "So?" Noah said, his voice firm but controlled, cutting through the silence. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Joe took a deep breath, gathering the courage he had built over the past months. "I'm sorry," he began, looking directly at Noah. "Not just to you and Millie, but to everyone I've hurt over the years. These 6 months have taught me more than I could have ever imagined. I saw the damage I caused and the impact of my actions. I know I can't erase the past, but I want to be better. I want to fix what I can." Noah stared at him for a long moment, the silence becoming almost unbearable. Finally he spoke, his voice neutral but incisive. "And how do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear?" Joe swallowed hard. He knew that any justification might sound empty. He chose the simple truth. "You don't know," he replied honestly, "but I can prove it. Give me a chance, and I'll show you I've changed." Noah studied Joe for a few more seconds, the weight of his evaluation evident. Finally he nodded, although his gaze remained firm. "We'll see," he said. "You're on probation. One mistake, and you're out for good." Joe nodded, relieved but aware of the responsibility he carried. "Thank you, sir." "I won't let you down." Noah stayed standing, watching as Joe walked out to resume his position, now a man with a different perspective. The road to regaining the team's and the community's trust would be long, but for the first time, Joe felt he was ready to do the necessary work. As part of his new mission, Joe decided that he needed to go beyond simply completing his probationary period. He volunteered to lead anti-racism workshops aimed at new recruits in the department. His approach was simple but powerful, to share his own story without hiding the mistakes he made or the consequences he faced. It was an act of vulnerability he never thought he would be capable of before. "I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do," he said in one of the sessions. I'm here to show you what happens when you let your prejudices make decisions for you. I learned the hard way that the uniform we wear demands more than strength. It demands respect and empathy." Those words, combined with the honesty in his stories, began to make an impact. The recruits listened attentively, not only out of obligation, but because they saw in Joe an example of possible change. Little by little, his reputation in the department began to rebuild. Colleagues who had previously avoided him started noticing his genuine dedication to correcting past mistakes. A few weeks later, an unexpected invitation came. Noah called him for a dinner at his house. The idea was simple but loaded with meaning. Joe knew that this moment represented more than just a meal. It was an opportunity to reconnect with the people who had played the biggest role in his transformation. That night, when he rang the doorbell at Noah's house, Joe's heart started to race. He still didn't know how Millie would react, even after all the progress. When the door opened, Millie greeted him with a warm smile. "I heard you've been doing a good job," she said, her voice calm but firm. Joe, still uncertain, responded with humility. "I'm trying," he said. "Thank you." Throughout the dinner, the atmosphere became more relaxed. They spoke openly about the impact of that experience. Joe shared his journey and how each step had changed the way he viewed the world. Millie shared the difficulties and hopes she faced as a black woman in a world still marked by inequalities. And Noah, with the same firmness he showed at work, spoke about his vision of a more just and accountable department. At the end of the night, as Joe got up to leave, Millie accompanied him to the door. Before he left, she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, Joe, this is just the beginning. Change isn't something you do once and that's it. It's something you have to work on every day." Joe nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I will," he promised, his voice full of sincerity. As he left, Joe felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a true sense of closure. Not because the journey was over, but because, for the first time, he knew he was on the right path, and this time he wouldn't turn back. The years that followed showed the depth of Joe's transformation. Not only did he change, but he became a living example of how redemption is possible. Determined to give back what he had learned, Joe dedicated himself to building bridges between the police and the community, something that had once seemed unreachable. Within the police force, he took on the role of a mentor. The new recruits saw him not just as an instructor, but as someone who made them reflect on the impact of their actions. He shared stories, not as warnings, but as lessons. "The badge you wear is not a shield of power, it's a commitment to the people you serve," he often said. Outside the department, his influence grew even more. Joe began attending community events, listening to stories he would have ignored before. He worked alongside local leaders to implement programs that promoted diversity and inclusion, ensuring that the voices of marginalized communities were heard and respected. Millie was right. Change never ends, and Joe embraced it completely. The impact wasn't just on him. His journey inspired others within and outside the police force to examine their own prejudices. He became an example of how admitting mistakes and seeking to improve is not weakness, but strength. Years later, at a police department ceremony, Joe was surprised when he was called to the stage. It was an official recognition for his contributions to transforming the relationships between the police and the community. He walked onto the stage with firm steps, but when he looked at the audience, he felt a lump in his throat. Among the crowd, he saw Noah and Millie smiling proudly. When he took the microphone, his voice faltered for a moment. He took a deep breath, trying to control the emotion. "I didn't get here alone," he began, his voice full of gratitude. "I owe everything to the people who believed I could change, to those who didn't give up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." He paused, staring at Millie, who nodded gently. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." The applause that followed was deafening, but for Joe, the greatest reward wasn't the honor received, but the certainty that he had finally become the person he should have been from the start. His work, his story, and his journey were now much more than personal redemption. They were a beacon of hope for all who believe that change, no matter how difficult, is always possible. Do you want to hear more inspiring stories like this? Then leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And let's chat in the comments. Where are you watching us from? We'd love to know.